Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are today. Please welcome Henriette Kolb to the stage. Henriette serves as the Global Manager for Sustainable Infrastructure Advisory at the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group. She is based in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, Henriette worked in the UK, Palestine, Tanzania, Northern Ireland, and Germany with the UN, the European Commission, the Sherry Blair Foundation, and the German bilateral aid organization GIZ. She is a mother of two boys, loves poetry, music, and being outdoors. Henriette's going to talk to us about the future of critical minerals through climate smart mining. So with that, I pass it to you, Henriette.
Thank you, Tim. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, lovely people interested in climate. I'm very excited to talk to you briefly this morning about why critical minerals are essential in the future. Whether we like it or not, critical minerals are essential to afford us a green transition. But just how badly do we need them? Let's dive right in. This is how much we need the energy transition to be mineral intensive. 3 billion tons of minerals and metals will be required by 2050 to achieve an even modest 2-degree scenario, which is an equivalent to about 300,000 Eiffel Towers. So no small feat. But if we want to run faster, which I think we should, we would require 6 times more mineral inputs. But what's behind these figures? In fact, EV and battery storage have the highest demand and would require 30 times the output by 2040. And then followed closely by the low carbon energy production, where offshore wind and solar PV are leading the pack, and we would require a tripling of minerals. But just extraction alone will certainly not get us there for a number of reasons. And this is why the World Bank Group stood up in 2019 the Climate Smart Mining Initiative, which is focused to supporting countries, companies, and communities to not just extract, which would lead us in the wrong direction, but sustainably extract, process, and recycle the mineral and metals. We can only move forward if we create benefits that are there to be shared for all, which means we need to build mining companies and fund mining companies that leave value in the country. And to do that, we have come up with a framework that helps us achieve this goal. We deliver to this framework by a variety of interventions, such as global knowledge, and I'm going to talk to you about one of these outputs in just a minute, through country engagements, through lending operations, most importantly, citizen engagement, and through partnerships. No sector can achieve this transition alone. So what's behind the Climate Smart Mining Framework? There are 4 pillars of engagement: decarbonization, resilience, the circular economy, and market opportunities. Now, surely to no surprise to you as viewers, most of the emphasis to date has been on the decarbonization side, and we need to continue to plug away on that. Having said that, in a lot of the markets that the IFC and the World Bank works in, developing economies, resilience is critical, and adaptation and implementation finance is absolutely essential. And that's where I want to come back to in just a minute. But now, what's in it for companies, you might ask? Why would companies take these measures and advance on those 4 pillars? Well, there are 4 reasons to that. One is they want to secure stable operations. In fact, already 50% of lithium and copper supply is being produced in countries that are high water distressed. The second reason is they want to access financing they would maybe otherwise not get, which is sustainability-linked loans or bonds, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Thirdly, they want to be competitive and have a competitive advantage, so investing early in climate-smart technologies prepares them better for the energy transition. And last, but certainly not least, obviously regulation, reporting requirements, disclosures are increasing, and so they need to meet those demands. So there's 4 reasons as to why companies, at least 4, why they would want to do to do this. So just 2 weeks ago, we launched a guide for mining companies that is focused on adaptation. As I briefly mentioned, the focus has been to date largely on mitigation, and we've heard various speakers today to talk more about that. But why is adaptation so essential? In fact, it's essential because we can mitigate climate blind spots. One, this guide is hoping to address some uncertainty around climate hazards. It tackles the increased frequency of these climate events, and they become the norm, as we've all seen and experienced. It looks at really prioritizing physical risk and vulnerabilities, etc., over just transition risk. And then it looks at not just focusing on the mine, but also outside the mine. So what does the supply chain look like? What do communities need to benefit from when it comes to climate adaptation? And so the guide provides real case studies, a huge number of practical tools based on scientific literature. And so it also, at the end of it, outlines a number of financial services and products that companies can tap into if they have rigorous and publicly available climate adaptation commitments. So let's unpack it just a little. Unfortunately, when you look at this map, a lot of the mines and resource-rich countries are also experiencing extreme climate events already. So they're highly climate vulnerable. There also is a lot of fragility around resources, and they're oftentimes least equipped to adapt. We've seen mining companies experience severe floods, actually just last week in Guinea, where we invest in one of the mines. We've experienced droughts, severe water unpredictability, intense storms, etc. And this has caused severe health and safety impacts for workers, for their supply chain. It's increased capital expenditures, it's reduced production, etc. So this is lived experience day in, day out. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop at the company line. These events also exacerbate, if not managed properly by those companies, the way that communities can adapt to climate change. And if there's no plan in place, no measurement, no mitigation, and no community dialogue, what we've seen is actually, if that is left unfeathered, communities suffer most. You see an increase in soil, air, and water pollution. You see degradation of soil. You see an unraveling license to operate and social unrest. So we want to make sure that if we mine, we tackle these challenges early on and continuously. On that slide, all I want to just point out very briefly is once you embark on a climate risk assessment, obviously based on Paris alignment, you look at transition risk and physical risk. But when physical risk sets in, you want to look at 4 dimensions: hazard, exposures, impacts, which is sort of what has happened already in the market. But the vulnerability part is absolutely critical to the success of your plan. And vulnerability can be broken down into an ecological vulnerability, infrastructure aspects, and social aspects. Now, climate risk resilience and adaptation never ends, and in some ways never starts, because you have a continuous cycle when you look at climate risk assessment and implementation. So first, if you haven't done an assessment and analysis, you would look at producing one, and that has been done in the market. We've seen quite a number of them. However, oftentimes, it stops at the company fence and it doesn't include the other dimensions of your value chain. Second, once you've decided, you have a rigorous analysis that's robust, you design an intervention plan, and ideally with interim goals. So don't wait and make goals until 2030, 2040, 2050, but really have annual goals that you're also disclosing. And here you can invest in 4 critical capital assets: human, natural, physical, and financial. And I come back to that on the next slide. Then you would have a measured implementation pathway that sets KPIs that help you measure whether you're on the right track. You evaluate and assess and refine and then go back. But absolutely essential in that circle is stakeholder engagement. And it's not enough, and we've seen that it's not enough to consult at the beginning of a project. You need to consult throughout, in particular, because of course mining companies have such a long lead time in terms of productions, planning, and then execution. So you need to have this continuous dialogue. Now, if you start producing an implementation plan, the way you can frame the interventions are around those 4 capital assets. We've seen most of the financing go into physical capital. infrastructure, equipment facility, etc. We've seen more and more focus on just transition, meaning literacy training on climate, workforce skills building, evacuation preparedness training, but a lot more can be done of linking the environmental and the social side. Oftentimes, they're too often siloed and fragmented. We've seen recent real big attention on natural capital and biodiversity, and we have the COP in Cali coming up. We've seen a lot of mining companies place real value on that. And then clearly financial capital is critical, not just again for risk insurance at the company level, but really looking at how can communities access climate insurance, parametric insurance, etc. And if all those four elements are being looked after, companies can then reap some of the benefits that are outlined here on the slide. I don't need to highlight them again, but there is definitely a very strong business case in adaptation finance. And adaptation finance, as you will know, is woefully low. Only 10% of global climate finance goes towards adaptation. UNEP, in its last year's climate adaptation report, actually outlined that in developing countries, you would need 160 to 340 billions by 2030 if you were to meet the adaptation needs. So massive amount of money that is still to be invested. So if companies decide to move forward on an adaptation and plan and implementing those goals, there's a number of commitments companies can take. And we've seen some of the most popular ones that I've now reflected here on this slide, being around water stewardship, because there's competition, of course, of scarce waters and desalination can be used, etc. So not to compete with community water resource needs. An impetus around human rights and strengthening that across the value chain. Seen a lot more commitments around disaster preparedness and early warning systems, conservation, as well as climate governance and skills development. However, there's a lot more room to be done there. As I previously said, it's critical that these commitments are public, they're measurable, and they're disclosed regularly. But not just to shareholders or regulators. It's really critical that you disclose some of those indicators that are relevant for communities on a regular basis and engage with dialogue. IFC is running a digital to development program that focuses exactly on that, and I can come back to that in a conversation with Tim, perhaps. Finally, what does it take to make all of this happen? Is money. Now, there's some good news in the fact that you have a ton of financial instruments that can incentivize better company behavior. And it's about using those. And just sort of by quick examples, we have obviously sustainability bonds and loans that are focusing on using the proceeds to advance the adaptation journey. So these are projects that are then financing nature-based solutions or adaptation on the physical climate risks or increasing skills of workers. So use of proceeds are being used. Mining industry is doing already some of it, but has room to grow. For example, green bonds in the mining sector stand at 6.3 billion, social bonds 4.3 billion, and sustainable bonds at 1.8 billion. So there is opportunity to doing more. The second category is sustainability-linked bonds and loans, where you actually have a KPI performance targets that links to the pricing that stems from your adaptation and implementation plan. And there we've seen so far companies in the mining sector take 26.2 billion of sustainability-linked bonds and loans. And this is something we've tried to do as well as an investor to really make sure we have measurable, rigorous, robust commitments on social and environmental goals when we look at sustainability-linked bonds. Then we have concessional finance and blended finance. Everyone wants it. Very few people can get it. It's usually very much utilized for smaller companies in developing countries or innovative technologies that are on the cusp of breaking through and becoming commercial. And then last but not least, there's a ton of other financial products. You can also, of course, look at listed green equity. So with that, if you're curious around climate smart mining and what more we can do together, check out the other resources that we have. It's a joint effort of the World Bank Group. I've put some of the resources out there that are more focused on the mitigation side. You see the net zero roadmap to 2050 for copper and nickel, but also something that's very critical to us as IFC is not just creating and copy-pasting a future for men, but really taking advantage of bringing more women into the sector, which is the gender gap is one of the largest in any sectors at the workforce, in the leadership, and the supply chain. So you see one of the publication touches on that. And I think the previous speaker had some phenomenal practical examples on how to bring women into climate change conversations. Now, partner with us. Here we are. you can contact Namrata, you can contact Arjun, who leads the climate advisory, Namrata leads mining, or myself after this conversation. Now I stop sharing my slides and I turn back to Tim.
Thank you, Henriette. Maybe in the 3 minutes or so we have remaining, you could tell us what the IFC is doing to ensure the climate risk and adaptation considerations are included in your lending operations. Maybe you can share an example.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. So absolutely, it's definitely important that we walk the talk when we engage with our clients. And so from an IFC perspective, we focus on 3 elements. One is our performance standards. These are 8 standards where we look at environmental, social obligations and compliance that companies have to meet at the very bare minimum when it comes to mining or any other sector. The second layer is the Paris alignment, where IFC, along other multilateral development banks, is committed to having 100% of our deals aligned with Paris. So every single deal that we do in any sector would have to go through a Paris alignment screening. And where we see deficiencies or gaps, we work with those companies to close these key gaps. But then we're going one step further, where we go into actually working with companies to create some of these adaptation pathways and risk assessment. So currently we're working with a hydropower company in Armenia, for example, on their climate risk assessments and future-proofing their operations. We're also engaging with the Panama Canal in a climate risk assessment with Panama Canal, and we're expanding that work as we speak, as well as with all our mining companies. And so we're working on that in Guinea, working on that in Argentina, working on that in Pakistan. So it's something that goes into the more value creation conversation, where we entice companies to doing more and doing better by linking one of our loans and providing some advisory services to them. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. We're continuing to learn. And I think that's the most important part, is the disclosure and the learning, and then moving along in partnership with others. It's also essential that we work with the World Bank. A lot of times, obviously, governments are critical partners in the mining journey, and making sure that government is disclosing the revenue generated from mining in a transparent manner, and then reinvesting that into the companies, communities around them.
Great. I guess we have a little bit more time. So what are some incentives for getting those mining companies to engage with communities around climate risks and opportunities?
Yeah, so perhaps I'd like to come back to a program we're running that's called the Digital to Development Program, which helps companies do a data governance assessment and helps them. They're collecting swaths of ESG data day in, day out, but oftentimes it's used obviously for the company's own purposes, or it's to use to disclose to shareholders. And so what we've done is, with Guinea company in bauxite, with in Mongolia, with a company there, is to help them decide of these hundreds and hundreds of data points, what might be most useful to the communities around them in order to have a dialogue around priorities in the climate adaptation journey. Because there's so many things one could be doing, but it's really critical that we hear and listen to communities in what they prioritize and not assume we know that, right? Either as an investor or as a company. So just to be very specific, for example, in Guinea, we work with the company to collect all the data on ESG and then whittle it down and translate it into a language that is meaningful, but literally into a language that is meaningful for company, for the communities, in the sense of translating it into the language that's spoken in that specific part. These are situations that need to be highly contextualized. So after we related and translated it into that language, we then prioritized in focus group discussions with communities, what's the data points that they need to manage their agriculture, their water consumption, their supply chain to the company, the mining company itself. We then whittled it down to about 9 data points, and now the company starts disclosing them regularly. Great. We're curious to see how the usage is going to be, and then we'll refine it further. I think we're out of time.
We're out of time, unfortunately. Thank you for sharing your valuable work that you're doing with us today. And unfortunately, we have to move on to the next speaker. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Tim. Take care. Bye.